Hello everyone. This week I was asked to demonstrate how to work with constraints. And one of the nice ways to work with constraints is to have a cell library, and that way you can use these items and create multiple things from one object. There's a couple things that I was working with this week, and so let's get started by creating a new cell library. I'm going to browse to the seed folder, which hopefully should come up to the default location. And inside of here should be a file.cell, aeccelseed.cell. And I'm going to use that as my seed file. And I'm going to come down to plan sets, standards, cell, and create a cell library. Let me verify this. Did I create a... Nope, I guess I'm just working in this AEC template English right now. So let's try this again. Start AEC cell.cell. I'm going to go to the template English plan sets 06 standard cell folder and create a my cells cell library. So I'm going to change it to all files and call it .cel and hit save. And this will create a cell library. Then what I will need to do is create a new model. So I'm going to come over here to home. I'm going to hit model. I'm just going to say new. And I'm going to create a new design model 3D. And I'm going to say what this is going to be. This is going to be my parametric bar scales. And this is going to be able to be placed as a cell, going to be able to be placed as an annotation cell, and is going to be a parametric cell. And I'm going to create a view group for that, and I'm going to hit OK. And default, I'm going to turn off the default one here because I don't want to place default as a cell. I don't want it to show up when I attach it as a cell library. Then what I'm going to do is come in and look at the design file settings for this. I'm going to crank this all the way up so I get the maximum amount of accuracy, but I'm going to play in feet and inches, and I'm going to play in feet. So I'm going to move it off of survey feet to feet. 304 800 per foot and maximum accuracy. Then I'm going to come in and place a cell that I'm going to use as my baseline because I need the information of what a bar scale should look like. So I'm going to attach a 1, and to begin with I'm just going to find the full scale bar scale, but I'm going to try to recreate all of these bar scales from one file. So I'm going to place this thing, and the location I'm going to place it is 0, 0, so I'm going to hit F11 and then PP to bring up the absolute XY coordinate, and then I'm going to say 0, 0, 0. So that way it's placed at 0, 0, so my starting locations will be where they're supposed to be. And I want to verify my annotation scale here. So I'm set to full scale. All of my settings look to be correct at this point. And here's the bar scale. I should probably turn on fill because that appears to be off. And okay, now the next thing that I want to do with this cell is drop it because I want to turn this cell into individual line work. Yep, but something appears to be weird going on here with the levels. Do I have level lock on? Yep, let's turn that off. Okay, now I can drop this. These items should be on 0, 0. So the only thing that I really want to start with is this vertical line. That I know is exactly where it's supposed to be. The rest of this stuff, I'm just going to move it out of the way for now. And I'll probably leave the text right where it's at for the time being so I can get some other placements off of that later. But now I'm going to come over to this Constraints tab. And I'm going to lock this line in place because this is going to be what I'm going to be basing everything else off of. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to fix the two endpoints. So if I hover over it, you can kind of see how there's a black line coming in. I wonder if I change my background color. Let's see, if I come over here to File, Settings, User, Colors, or is it File, Colors, Color Table, here we go. I'm going to change my background color for this cell to be something maybe in the mid-grays. Let's see if that helps the visualization. Now you can really see when I'm picking certain points and what I'm snapping to. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fix the endpoints of this line. And notice that it's showing a locked location here, so that those things are never going to move on me. So if I come in here and look at the degrees of freedom of this item, notice that it says 0. That means that item cannot move. So now I got to start affixing everything to this line and making sure that the degrees of freedom are 0 to that line. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe move some of this stuff around a little bit. There's a line here, there's a line there. I think there's a line in the middle here someplace. Yeah, let's just move these things out of the way. Let's see what all I have my hands on here. So I got all of these items that I need to affix somehow and lock down to my parametric, or constrain, so that when I make my parametric cell, it moves the way I want it to. So the next item, I want to be able to make this line perpendicular to that line and affixed to the endpoint of that line. So if I make it coincident, that will make it affixed to the endpoint. So I'm going to make this line, or that point and that point, coincident. So now those two things are locked. But the thing that this line here can do is rotate around and be any length. So if you look at this, and I grab these bullet endpoints, notice the one endpoint stays put, but the other one can move, so that can be rotated. So I need to constrain that a bit tighter. So I'm going to make that perpendicular. So what am I making it perpendicular to, and then what am I making it perpendicular to that line? So you always pick your first item as the thing that you want to make it set to, and the second item you pick is the item you want to set. So now this line is perpendicular to that line. The only thing I can do with it is change the length. So if I have my length set, what I really need to do is set a variable, because the bar scales can either be 2 inches long or 3 inches long depending on which scale we're working with. So I'm going to come in here to variables. I'm going to add a local variable, and I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this bar scale width. And I'm going to set that to my default value, so I'm going to set that to 0. For the most part, it's going to be 2 inches. So I'm going to set that variable in here. And I'm going to hide it because I don't want the end user changing it. So I'm just going to hide that thing. But it's going to be a distance. It's going to be instance, no expression. So all I really have to do is come in and make this thing that width. So I'm going to move this out of the way. And I'm going to come in and say by element. And when I come in here, I can pick bar scale width. So now that's always going to be 2 inches. So these two lines, I hope, are fully constrained. So if I hit degree of freedom on that, yep, these two lines now are fully constrained. They can't move no matter what you change. Well, except for if you change the variable. So let me show you kind of how that operates. If I make this a little bit smaller so you guys can see, if I change this to be 3 instead of 2 and then apply it, now notice how it made it 3 inches long instead of 2 inches long. But I'm going to set this back to 2 now, so that way I can make sure that these things are lined up and the degrees of freedom are 0. Now I'm going to come back into my lines and start affixing things again. So the next thing I want to do is make these other two lines equal to this line's length. So if this one changes, these two change. So from this line, I want to apply it to that line. Now those two lines are always equal. And from this line, I want to make that line equal. So now I can't change the lengths of these, but I can change the position of these. So I need to start locking these down also. So the next thing I want to do is come over here to coincident, and the endpoint of this line I want to be coincident with the endpoint of that line. So now this one could be rotated around and do all kinds of stuff with it. Oh, maybe I can't change that. Let's see. I thought I could rotate that one still. Apparently not. So if that... I'm going to make that just a little bit more stable by making sure that this is parallel to that. So this little symbol says they're parallel. So the degrees of freedom now should only be applied to this line down here. And look, I can move this one around anywhere I want to yet. And I can still rotate it around. And I can still move this thing. So what I want to do, but I can't make it shorter or longer because those are equal, right? So that doesn't change. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that these two are parallel. So this one and this one are parallel. Now the only thing I can do is move this line around. So I want to fix the endpoint of this line to this line here. So I'm going to come in here and make them coincident. So this line and this endpoint are going to be coincident. Now I don't think I can move that much other than this line has to be touching somewhere along that one. Let me see if that's true. So if I come over here, can I move it? Or did it make it coincident to the midpoint? Let's see if my degrees of freedom, what does it say? Degrees of freedom are 0. So that means that line can no longer move. So we're good. That's all locked up. Now the next thing I want to do is take this end line and affix it to these points over here. So there I want to make coincident the endpoint of that and the endpoint of that. And then I also want to make these two things parallel. So this line here and that line there are parallel. And I also want to make them equal. That line and that line are equal. So now the degrees of freedom for those 5 lines should be 0. Let's see. Yep. So that's all locked down. Next thing I want to do is I want to bring this line coincident to that line. So let's take that and say we're going to go coincident and coincident. I want to make it, let's see, I want to make them to equal. So I want to make this line and that line equal. Let's see my degrees of freedom now. I got 2 degrees of freedom. So what is that telling me? I can move this line 2 ways. I can move it probably left and right. Yep. And I can also change the length, can I? No, I can't change the length because I made that equal. Oh, I can rotate it. So there's a couple things I don't want to have happen. So I want to make them 2 parallel. So now, what can I do with this? I think I can only move it left and right. If I grab one of those grips, come on, I can move this left and right. So what do I want to do to lock that in place? I think I want to take this distance here. No, I want to make those equal distance. So from here to there to there to be equal distances. There we go. Now that line has to be in the midpoint of those two. Now if I look at my degrees of freedom, 0. They're all locked down. Okay, I need to do the same thing with this line here, except it needs to be in the midpoint of those two. So the next thing I want to do is do my coincident to this line and that endpoint. I want to make them parallel. This line, that line, and that line are parallel. And I want to make them equal. That line and that line are equal. So now the only thing I can do is move this line left and right. But I want it to be centered between this line and that line, so I'm going to come in here with my equal distance, pick my first line, pick my second line, pick my third line, and make those equal distances. Now my degrees of freedom should be 0 again. Good. Now nothing can move. And I want to do the same thing with this one. So with this one, we repeat this thing again. We're going to do a coincident. We're going to do a parallel. And we're going to do a equal. And we're going to set these things equal distance, but this time we're going to put it to the midpoint of that one. There we go. Now let's see what my degrees of freedom look like. 0. Good. So if I look at this thing and I bring my variables in here, and if I change my width to be 3, notice these are half distances, and that's the full distance is 3 inches wide. So that's looking good. So now I'm going to put this back to 2 again. And I got to lock down these rectangles one way or another. So the first one goes on the bottom area, the second one goes into that area, the third one goes in the bottom here, and the fourth one goes there. So this one here I could lock fairly easily if I do a few things. I want to make these things parallel. So that line and that line are parallel. 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 Now this one can only change sizes, I believe. So the next thing I want to do is make these coincident. So I want to take the endpoint of that line and make it coincident with the endpoint of that line. And I want to take the endpoint of that line and make it coincident with the endpoint of that line. There we go. Let's see what my degrees of freedom are set to. I have no degrees of freedom, so now that should stretch equally. Now we're going to repeat this again with this next rectangle. So we're going to do some parallels. This is parallel to that. That is parallel to that. That is parallel to that. And that is parallel to that. And then we're going to make these things coincident. So we're going to take coincident. And we're going to find the endpoint of that rectangle and make it coincident with the endpoint of that rectangle. And we're going to make the endpoint of that line and the endpoint of that rectangle coincident. We're going to check our degrees of freedom. 0. So we're still in good shape there. And if I wanted to check how what my settings are set on an individual item, I can select that individual item and see what settings I have. So I got a lot of parallels with this line over here and two coincidents. So now I got 2 more rectangles to do. I'm going to move this up here so it's a little bit easier to work with. Let's see, that one goes into this area. So we repeat the steps again. Parallel, this line, that line, this line, that line, that line, that line, and that line, and that line. Those are parallel. Now we come in and do coincident. So we want to be coincident to the endpoint of that line with the endpoint of that line. And we want to be coincident with the endpoint of that line with the endpoint of that line. There we go. And then we got one more to go. And parallel this thing with that. This thing with that. That thing with that. That thing with that. And now we just have to make 2 things coincident. So we're going to set this line coincident with that line. And that line coincident with that line. There we go. So if we look at the bar, we're going to change this to 3 inches wide and see how that goes. Yep, it looks like everything is stretching the way it's supposed to. Let's look at the degrees of freedom. It's set to 0. You can almost see that there. If I zoom way in, there we go. You can see that set to 0. So that means this thing can't move. So I am now going to set this back to 2. And now I'm going to leave this here today, and then tomorrow what we'll do, I'll show you how to lock the text in and adjust the text. It's kind of a little bit tricky, so I'm going to leave that to the next session. So I'll talk to you tomorrow on setting the text.